Now it's recording.
This is Transect 1, the Horn of Africa.
Okie doke. I wonder how we can stay on subject rather than going all over the place.
Some of the sides are probably more interesting to the general public than any other parts of it. So, yes, let's do it as we wish.
Okay. Oh, boy. Well, for those who don't know what the Horn of Africa is, let me explain, having just had a lecture on the subject for over an hour.
If I knew what I were talking about, it would be much shorter.
Anyway, we can now define it as the part of Africa closest to Asia, and how it's gradually moving in that direction so that one day the two will be one. Okay. Well, you just came back from there. And so, sir, will you kindly tell us a little bit about that excitement?
Thank you, Fred. It was exciting. And it was exciting for lots of reasons. One of them being that this was our inaugural launch of our brand new mobile surgical units for Africa. Mission to Heal has been putting together.
I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
This is exactly. Gosh. And so it made the transect from Antwerp through around Gibraltar, through the Mediterranean, then down to the Suez Canal, and out into the Gulf and down to Djibouti, which is the point on the tip of the Horn of Africa that is the port, now an independent nation state, formerly a French colony. It was the most junior of the nations in Africa until South Sudan split from North. So now it is the 51st state in Africa of the 52 that are there. And as a consequence, Djibouti itself was our port. We were directing our units there, not because we wished, because ideally they could have come to Berbera, because Berbera is the port of Somaliland. And it would have been ideal on the Red Sea to bring them right in there so we wouldn't have to import them several nations away from our target, which was Somaliland. Oh, now 20 years ago, I had heard of this nation state that was formerly a British colony, the British colony of Somaliland. There was an additional Italian colony on the coast of Somalia. Mogadishu is its capital. Subsequently, there was a union, a coalescence of these two, because they both spoke the language Somali. But there was a schism later in that they had various forms of governance. The one that was selected by the Somalia, which is recognized by the United Nations, is the Council of Islamic Courts. It's a different kind of government, maybe closer to the Iranian model than it is to any of the Western models we're familiar with. The Somaliland went independently into a democracy, the only democracy in the Horn of Africa, in fact. But for lots of reasons, one of which is there are some major powers around that may not be too eager to have Somaliland recognized independently as a member of the United Nations family of 178 nations, because it has resources that they need. For example, it is the origin of some part of the Nile watershed. And as from Pliny the Elder forward, everyone has been curious about where does this life-giving water of the Nile originate. They're not too eager to turn that over to the control of a sovereign state elsewhere. So Somaliland remains politically invisible. At least it's not a member of the United Nations, it's not a member of the world community, and that we can't do negotiations of the kind that you might from banking a check somewhere else, and subsists largely over the efforts of its fairly resourceful people and its diaspora. Because during the Civil War, I think people are familiar if I just say a couple of buzzwords like Black Hawk Down and the invasion by the U.S. of the Somali coast there. That was a time when Said Barre was a dictator and had overtaken that area. He subsequently died in exile in Nigeria. That subsequent part, they had elections and they stand for their free elected component political parties and the like. So Somaliland was our target. Now, several reasons for that. One of those being that a long time ago, just before my visit there, I had met with and been introduced to a woman who is a very, very pivotal part of all of Somaliland history. She was born in Somaliland and was the daughter of the head of state. She then was said to be of some consequence, as her father used to say, you are a person that will be very, very much in the movement of the leadership of this new nation. He wanted her to have a good education, not necessarily common among the very Sunni population there that didn't think women were the sort that should be educated but should be used largely for reproduction. She subsequently went to school, was sent to boarding school in Djibouti, which is why she will figure prominently in this story, because she and I flew to Djibouti to help release the mobile surgical units out of their port there to which they were imported. So her name is Edna Adan Ismailia, and I can tell you very significantly, this very month, her biography came out. And her biography is a woman of firsts, and as she would say, just a midwife. Because she learned a little bit about obstetrics and gynecology and wanted to take on the principal problem of her home country, which at the time was the bottom of the nation states in the world, even though the United Nations had counted as a nation state, in the highest maternal and child mortality. Subsequently, she's worked hard on that, and that unenviable title has been taken over by Afghanistan, which has a maternal mortality of 1 in 7. That is, 1 in 7 women die in childbirth or in pregnancy, and the fertility rate in Afghanistan is 9. So that means that most likely any reproducing age woman has a very, very high risk of pregnancy in Afghanistan. And so did they in Somalia, in Somaliland. And as a consequence, she worked hard on that. She became somewhat influential for several other reasons. She then married the head of state, and during the period of, let's say, the Lyndon Baines Johnson era, she was here in Washington representing Somaliland, and at the time, a fairly pivotal person. Subsequently, she has become one of several ministry portfolios. She has had the Ministry of Interior and of the Economic Development, and also has been very influential in the Ministry of Health. But much of this was when she had gone into exile, largely on the basis of Saeed Barre thinking it would be really neat to have the former First Lady as an army officer in his own army, and impressed her into service there. She has a proud photograph of her in uniform saying that she escaped from that, became a UN official, and as a UN official, sent her salary into an account that would someday fund a hospital for women and child's health, MCH. So as a consequence, the Edna Adan Hospital was about to be built when I was there the first time. I went there the first time, and there was a group of people who were being trained as midwives. And as they were being trained as midwives, so did another group of people come around that wanted to know something about laboratory medicine. They also wanted to know something about tropical disease. They wanted to know about other things. And I gave them the first lectures in this Edna Adan Hospital. Edna Adan Hospital has morphed considerably. It is now the Edna Adan Medical School, and I thereby having given the first lectures in the Edna Adan Medical School and a graduating first class. It is part of Edna Adan University, all of it supported by her former UN salary pension program now. And around it she has a bunch of shops, all of which are leased. The primary beneficiary of that is the Edna Adan University, so she has a concession of what her future succession plan is. So Edna Adan University is a prominent producer of not only just the midwives that she originally started to work on, she also now is producing medical students and medical doctors. And I was giving lectures to each of those, and that was the primary reason that we selected Somaliland a nation state that's invisible to the rest of the world community because there is some contention as to who is Somalia when there is a Somali government consisting of the Council of Judicial Courts that has that title from Mogadishu, where it is its capital. Hargeisa is the capital of Somaliland, and Hargeisa is a capital built on where watercourses once went, but it's in the Somali desert, so it's very important as a piece of watering stop. And Hargeisa has a principal port down the road in Berbera, and it has another one that is a somewhat major site, and it's the site of another medical school beyond the one that Adan has, and the Hargeisa Medical School in the border with Ethiopia. I was going to make a transit of these and work in each of the places that I'd worked before, including Berbera on the Red Sea as the port. So when I went this time, we were going to do all of that by starting off in early January, and I'd had a group of volunteers all coming with me, and I was going to arrive. Coincidentally, for some reason, it's almost magic. It seems to happen on my birthday each year as I spend it abroad. That's what I was recovering from the 36 hours of travel to get there, arriving in Hargeisa, coming out of Addis Ababa directly on Air Ethiopia. So I arrived in Hargeisa and learned that the mobile surgical units had been somewhat delayed, and they were being offloaded in the port of Berbera and then would have to go through some kind of transaction to get them out. So my suggestion was, especially for Edna Adan's very, very responsive leadership there, she's very important and very, very humanitarian-oriented person, and as a consequence, I had nominated her and then presided over her induction into the Medical Mission Hall of Fame in Toledo, Ohio. Wow. And she remembers that fondly some 15 years ago or more. And as a consequence, she and I worked diligently in the Edna Adan Hospital. But she also insisted that I work in the Hargeisa Group Hospital, where I'd worked before. A number of people had been talking to me about it as the public hospital, the one that the majority of the population had to go to, especially those that didn't have any funding or didn't have any kind of a way of taking care of this. So as a consequence, what we did is that I shuttled back and forth between Hargeisa Group Hospital and its staff, one or two of which were displaced Syrian physicians, one of which is a superb young lady who is twice refugeed. She is Yemeni, and as a consequence can't go back to her homeland. She's married to a Yemeni from the other side, sort of like a north-south distribution in the United States, or the Catholic and the opposing family clans, like the Kentucky rivalries that there used to be. Now what it is, the Hatfields and McCoys couldn't get together, and she couldn't come back as the wife of this physician, and had spent some time in Pakistan and the places that I had worked. And I'll give you her name. Her name is Dr. Sabra Akil, and she has a genuine need for an improvement in the care there. And she will overcome all of the frustrations, being female in a very Islamic society, being foreign, being a Yemeni refugee in Hargeisa, which is Somaliland, which is not part of the United Nations and not a part of the world stage. As a consequence, she is the one who's going to have to improve things there where she's working. And she does a good job of it. There's a Dr. Shokri, who is a protege that had remembered me from the time of some of the earliest lectures, and she went through that Edna Adan Medical School, and she is now the protege of Edna Adan. So I worked with each of these proteges in each of these places. Meanwhile, the units have arrived in the port of Djibouti, my mobile surgical units for their inaugural mission on their big man cats. So we're eager to get them out, and with a number of telephone calls and emails and other things like that, we find out that they can't be cleared. Why? There's some confusion. They go to the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Commerce because they figure I am here to sell them and profit from that, importing these vehicles themselves. The last thing on my mind. Second is that if they are part of the Ministry of health, then I need to go talk to the Ministry of Health if this is a volunteer mission. If I am doing it in not Djibouti, but in Somaliland, I have to go to the Ministry of Interior to get them imported across the boundary, all of which means that I have a little diagram that shows with the GPS marker in pocket are traveling back and forth and back and forth and forth again in Hargeisa to each of these ministries, going to 3 different hotels for overnighting and trying to get the clearances until finally, with a carnet de passage, as showing that we are essentially on an extended leave from Europe, not for importation and sale in Africa, which we will try to renew when it becomes, but I have to then pay the European Union the tax that would have come from the sale of these units. So that's in escrow there, so I buy these units twice. So our mobile surgical units arrived in Djibouti. With all of this going on, Edna Adan takes me through the ministries all around in Hargeisa. We also included therein the ministry from Ethiopia in order to get the ambassador's approval for our transfer of the units into Ethiopia from Somaliland. Not easy, remember, because without official embassies from some of these foreign nations, without United Nations sanction, there is a process there. For example, the major U.S. embassy in the area is in Djibouti. And I became somewhat familiar with that because I went to the U.S. Embassy, and a very helpful fellow there who was going to notify each of the subsequent missions of the transect of our mobile surgical units. A very helpful fellow indeed. So Edna Adan and I were escorted into the airport where we are taken to the VIP section, she being the VIP, not I. And in that place we see the Minister of Interior coming in the other direction. And he had met me in Washington, D.C. in January. And so we exchanged comments, and they said we would like to get the units there for their inaugural use in Somaliland. So that puts Somaliland on the map. And I was so proud of our achievement of that inaugural use that she got us Somaliland flags and put those on each of the units. Even better, I hoisted her up into the driver's seat. At age 82, she is in the driver's seat of the man cat with the Somaliland flag behind her. Edna Adan deserves that photograph for the blow-up portrait which I've made for her. She's going to sign her new biography, and I'm going to give her the copy of her picture sitting in the driver's seat of the mobile surgical unit, the first use ever in Africa. So as a consequence, after doing all of that, can you believe she did not fly back to Hargeisa from Djibouti? She went with us with armed escorts through the Somali desert, noticing that when we are no longer invisible, we are now mobile, we're sending out signals, and we have the Somaliland flag. There are a number of neighbors that do not wish them well, for which reasons we had an escort from Djibouti to the border of Somaliland, and then we entered Somaliland with a new set of drivers, a new set of armed escort vehicles coming through the Somali desert. I did not say on a road through the Somali desert. These are my man-cat 6-wheel drive all-terrain vehicles that are unstoppable, and boy did we prove that. It's a story of some amusement to folks who weren't present at the time. They were wondering why it is that when I was the driver of the mobile surgical unit and could not turn right, and that included with both hands finally putting my foot up there and trying to shove the steering wheel and having a very difficult time of it, finally making a left turn and then coming around and a 6-point turn coming back over, getting to the Somaliland border just before it's 6 o'clock closing. Remember, this is near the equator, which I call perpetual equinox. So you have 6 hours p.m. and 6 hours a.m. Slight dark difference, and there will be. Well, I'm there, and they get the professional driver saying, "Why is this fellow having such a difficult time?" And he got in. He said, "I can't drive this. The steering is gone." In the course of offloading the vehicle from the Somali roll-on, roll-off ship, that ship was pushing these vehicles off, and they just couldn't get it off, not knowing that when you turn the key, the unit stays on until you make several different maneuvers. So they went underneath to try to pull out cables, and pulling out cables, they pulled out a cable that ruptured the power steering line. So I had a little difficulty managing this big machine. And much more difficulty because on the road there are camels. And I did not mean a couple of camels when I said plural. I mean not 1,000 camels, tens of thousands of camels. And they're coming back and forth. The camel slaughter is one of the big things that happens in a feast in Somaliland. And we were the privileged guests at one such. But we barreled through the Somali desert with Edna Adan Ismail, former First Lady, Minister of several portfolios, in the vehicles back there and going right through the same hardships we did. So we went through the Somali desert with pillars of sand that were being thrown up 100 meters in the air behind us, dodging camels, going across the desert, and navigating toward a little town which is called the Shoulder of the Mountain, in transliteration, to enter the mountains of Somaliland and come on up into Hargeisa. Along the way, we were going to be overnighting in one place where they said, oh, this is a special and distinguished group. Wherever Edna Adan goes, the whole population recognizes her. She's a regular on TV as well. And for that reason, with her honored guest, who's bringing these special units of modernity to the peoples of Somaliland for free service, they have to do something special. So they put out a camel slaughter and feast for us. We all sat on the floor, all of the men, that is, with one exception, and that is Edna Adan, who's sitting next to me, careful not to expose your souls to the rest of the people. That would be kind of an insult. And we had a camel feast while we were in that Somali desert. We entered then into Hargeisa Group Hospital and put the units there and used these units very productively. With the staff of Hargeisa Group Hospital, I gave lectures to the medical school of Hargeisa Group. I gave lectures to the Edna Adan University, as I had at the first one, and we operated in both institutions. In the time we were there, they recognized that I wasn't to take over care, I was to assist their care and how they could do it better. For that reason, they set to it with a will. And this was probably our most ideal kind of medical education enhancement of care, because especially Dr. Sabra Akil became my chief resident, sorting out patients, saying, we have 6 of these and 8 of these, and yes, we can do this one and that one, but let's have you do the first 2 of these, and then we'll take over from there. And she brought in several patients, one of whom I'll mention only because it's of interest. It was of interest to the president of Somaliland, and that is the reason for our all receiving presidential citations and medals. One of the women that came in with her head covering, the woman in complete chador, was coming in to have her gallbladder removed because there had been identification on our little phone application of a tiny little device that hooks to a smartphone and can show you sonographic images. We identified gallstones. And so she was going to have her gallbladder removed. In fact, that day I had done the first cholecystectomy for each of 3 different trainees. They did their first ever cholecystectomy. 1, 2, and 3 different trainees had all done it. She was going to be the 4th, and one of them was going to do it as the second cholecystectomy. A young woman who is just underneath the Dr. Sabra Akil. As a consequence, we brought her in there. We were going to now have to do general anesthesia and remove her head cover to do so in order to intubate her. And when we did that, I said, say, what's this? She did not want her head cover removed, and if we were going to see her face, she only wanted this part of it because she didn't want anyone to see this. And what is this? It's a tumor right in front of her ear. It was growing in that area such that it was thinning out the skin and looked fairly aggressive in terms of its nature. I said, now you have 3 new individuals who can take out a gallbladder. They can do that anytime. They can do that when I'm not here. However, what you have here is called a Warthin's mixed tumor. The real name of it is a pleomorphic adenoma, and it is locally aggressive and recurs. There has never been one, I discovered, in the history of Somaliland. that's been removed. So this would be the first experience of anyone anywhere. So I said, I am eager to take Dr. Sabri Akil through this operation. So she is about to experience her first total parotidectomy in her life. And this woman is about to be the first Somaliland patient to undergo that operation, which we did. We did it well, and she had perfect function of all branches of her seventh nerve. The facial nerve goes through the parotid. So in other words, a great success for the first operation. And that is one of the commendation citations from the president when he saw us on our final day and awarded us each a medal for our being there. I said, I would do so only if you could take the primary people who are the real heroines, including Sabra Akil, Dr. Shokri, and Dr. Edna Adan. And so they were present, Dr. Edna Adan especially, since she is an intimate of all those people in the Somaliland government. So our stay in Somaliland, first was my operating in the Edna Adan Hospital, secondly in the Hargeisa Group Hospital, and then giving lectures in both the Hargeisa Group Hospital and hands-on demonstrations of several other things, doing the same in the Edna Adan University Medical School. And then the culmination was the arrival of our mobile surgical units, which we used to 15 or 20 operations, all of a higher order, meaning we weren't just taking lumps, we were taking little kids who had contractions of burns and doing full thickness grafts to open up their hand to make a functional hand. We did a switch graft of a fellow who had malignant ulcer here, excising the ulcer and doing a rotation flap. We did multiple plastic surgical procedures that involved full thickness grafts, and we also did a lot of scar contracture releases, as well as a number of general surgical procedures such as complex hernias, the cholecystectomies I mentioned, and of course the first head and neck primary parotid excision. So this really qualifies as an advanced use of our mobile surgical units in their baptism of fire, I should say baptism of sand, because we've sent a fair amount of Somali sand into the atmosphere with it. And therefore, they were ideally deployed for our Somaliland inauguration in the first part of our Horn of Africa mission. So a success all around, and when we left, Sabra Akil penned something that sounded almost like poetry when translated to English. She said, "You came in a whirlwind and thunder and left only the rainbow behind." It's what I often say about what I hope to do in Africa. I hope to be the Cheshire Cat, arriving and leaving nothing but the smile, and no need for the remembrance of the name, because it's a little difficult for them to understand the same way it is for me to understand some of their names, but I identify their personalities largely on the basis of their motivation to take care of their people and do it well. Somaliland then was an absolute marker, first of all, of the miracle machines that the mobile surgical units turned out to be, and secondly, of the well-motivated personnel who jumped a quantum level upon our visit as our medical education and our surgical techniques were recognized not just by those people who are the trainees and the medical students, but also by the president of Somaliland, who gave a medal to each of us and requested our early return, which will be in 3 months more.
Wonderful story. My God, I knew what we were working on those units, and I had no idea it was going to be that big a jump. But you know, when you think about it, those machines are absolutely miracle makers.
And I agree with you there, Fred, and I'd say that is what I hope to do. I don't want to do 500 hernias or horrors, as they said to me in one of the places later. We have an American professor coming to do 1,000 circumcisions. Now, wait a minute, you don't need a professor of surgery, you don't need a doctor, you don't need a surgeon for sure. That can be done by a trainee that we can equip to do that. And that's our primary mission. Our output product is not 65 patients operated. Our output product is 50 people empowered to carry out a much larger multiplier of that effect. And this Somaliland proved and did it very well.
Wonderful. Gosh.
We moved on through Somaliland to the border, and the border this time is with Ethiopia. There are a couple of things about Ethiopia that did not work as planned, and one or two of them were political. And that was, we were going to go to Addis Ababa for the African Union Convention, And they wanted to just keep our mobile surgical units there to say, see what we're doing. That means parked in a lot so they could be pointed to, but nothing actually happening in them. We said, no, we are coming here to work, and we did so. We moved up from Addis into the highlands at a fairly considerable altitude. If you think of Africa as a place that's warm, remember, these are women coming around, and lots of people with their white robes of wool right up to their eyes, because we're at 4,000 meters altitude.
Wow.
In the highlands. And so we're in a village called Malali, which had no paved road, and we were at a brand new hospital, opened up as a primary care hospital, staffed by a number of recent graduates. The recent graduates were from that last graduating class, who are paying back their medical school by being sent to a remote place. To give you some idea, what this is considered as a hardship post is that you are owing the medical school 4 years if you go to, let's say, an inner city place or someplace that's underserved. To go to a borderland area of Malali, you pay back your medical school in 2 years. Every one of them there was there for 2 years and saying, I got to get out of here. I want to go back to where there's electricity, where there's plumbing, and they're talking about. And in comes the mobile surgical units. Suddenly, modernity descends right there, and they were all eager to see it. So the hospital hadn't yet opened, and we were the opening of that hospital. So we brought in patients by the score. In fact, when I say by the score, I mean that quite literally, because every day we would do like 20 operations. You would see 200 patients lined up for the next day, and then there'd be 2,000 of them in transit. At the end of our stay there, which was extended a bit, because there was such a demand for the services, do more. You can always do another 100. Well, we didn't want to get pushed into doing just a service component. We wanted to teach the people locally. And at the end of that time, we figured that we had operated on 3% of the families in the entire province by the time we left. So there's a fairly large influence from that. But the more important influence is we got them used to the operations and the efficiency inside the mobile surgical unit. And then we moved those operations into their new hospital, inaugurating their own operating room. They reciprocated with an in-kind festival that you can't believe. They mobilized all the school children and all kinds of people so that when we would move, the units, for example, with their flashers on, all along the way, the roads are lined by thousands of people holding signs that say, "Mission to heal." Without education, the world would be a darker place. Someday I want to be like you, that sort of thing, all of which was very, very flattering to someone. I was pointing out the people here are the ones that you're going to be supporting. And so we went to a little spot called Wageri, where they had a very, very big formal celebration for us, swathing us each in the white robes that they have to wear because high, dry desert highlands in a remote site. So we had a reasonably successful remote location primary hospital associated, and the number of trainees were all brand new, including the director of the hospital had been a medical student 3 months before and was very keen on our coming again. But largely, remember, they first thought we were going to come and unburden them for the service burden, and then later they realized this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance for us to have some very, very intensive and extensive medical education. And that's what most of them wrote in their evaluation. Please come again, because never since I entered university have I had such a good educational experience. So that was, again, reinforcing our primary objective. We take good care of the bottom billion, but the medical education in order to indigenize care is our primary priority. From that area, we moved to another one. Now, remember that when I say another one, I'll have to give you a little bit of political background about Ethiopia. It's a federation more than a nation. So there are provinces that are nearly autonomous. And they have different languages, they have a very different culture, and at some points they are in very direct conflict. So we were in the Amharic-speaking peoples, And we were going to go to the Tigrini area above Lake Tana. And in so doing, we would need new drivers and new escorts and new translators, and none of the people from the Amharic region were authorized or even invited to come along. And the reason that is that there was direct animosity. In fact, there had been some casualties on the border. And they kept talking about when we cross the border, we'll get new. What border? We're inside Ethiopia. No, that's the other province on the other side. So we knew there was some sort of conflict between them because the Ministry of Health of each province had invited us to come in. Neither were that interested in our leaving. And so
I got to interrupt here. I've been watching some programs on Ethiopian agriculture, and I've noticed huge differences in the different regions and how advanced they are.
Exactly that.
Oh my goodness.
And when you look at that, you look at it from the road. Look from the road. I'm on an unpaved road going up the mountains, and I see yoked oxen pulling a plow. I'm in the Old Testament in agronomy right here. And then I've come from the city where there's urban planning and the Chinese are making huge roads and skyscrapers and very, very advanced stuff. And then I go out back to the periphery and there's a different people speaking a different language who don't have a market over there because they have to cross through Amharics. Remember that there's a whole lot of hope right now with the new president of Ethiopia because for the first time he is Oromo, which is the majority population. And before this, from the time of Menelik and all of the emperors, they were always Amharic. And Amharic became the official language because it was the language that came on down from the highlands. And the city of Addis Ababa is a rather recent development, all within the last century.
Well, which would be the area I was looking at when I saw some very advanced agriculture going on?
Right. You were looking at the area of the Amharic provinces. And that means that they have international connections. They are the ones who run Air Ethiopia, a good airline. They are the ones that run many of the industrial and parts of the state. This is the first time in history that there's been a head of state who is Oromo. And Oromo is the majority of the population, and they've been very backward. In fact, in the area of the Oromo, there is an area that I had gone to once before with the people called the Hammer people. And the Hammer people are pre-biblical. They are largely unclothed. They are sitting there near the equator, so therefore warmer and not in the highlands. And they are subsistence foragers more than they are even agronomists. So as a consequence, there are several different Ethiopias, and the population is large. In the middle of all that, you have mountains that gather the rain clouds, giving abundant rainfall in areas and good agricultural land that could feed the whole of the continent if there weren't these political barriers in between. And transit in and out is difficult. Now beyond that, Ethiopia owns both Niles. The White Nile comes up the Rift Valley, and I've crossed it twice, from the eastern scarp to the western scarp across the Millennium Bridge. Millennium Bridge was a cooperative project with Japan. Millennium, of course, occurred in 2005 because they are in the Gregorian and not the Julian calendar. I ran the Millennium Marathon. That was in that era of 5 years after our own millennium had passed. So, in essence, what we're dealing with is a very, very advanced nation state. And in Addis Ababa, there is even a group now, a brand new group, and I know them quite well, called Ethio-American Doctors Group. The EADG is building an American hospital, a fully tertiary hospital for those who are in that advanced cadre and can purchase either insurance or fee-for-service to prevent the diaspora of medical tourism, and they don't want that to happen. So the diaspora out here are going back to Ethiopia, first of all because it's a for-profit hospital, and secondly because they can use the language, and third because it's kind of their own association. The remote people are mine. They leave that clientele to me because there's no money in it. And as a consequence, we have to work on that. Now, the other part of it, we didn't know this until we were there. We actually heard this, that the Tigrini population that had invited us, and the Minister of Health that invited us, received a message from the Amharic-speaking people trying to retain us that there is a big modern mobile surgical facility coming with an American professor to sterilize the Tigrini. And that was obviously a rumor that had its intent, which was to disrupt all kinds of things. So what we had done is come forward to the Amharic Ministry of Health at Darmadar, right on the Lake Tana. While we were waiting for this clearance, we had stopped in a place for a week, and in that area, they asked us, oh, you have modern new devices here. This is wonderful. Could you give us bupivacaine? The brand name is Marcaine. It's a long-lasting local anesthesia. We had a case of it. And we will give you some lidocaine, which is a short-acting. It's a pretty good deal for them if they got to switch back and forth. And so they came back within a minute saying, no, 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 we want your fresh bupivacaine. This is outdated. It was outdated in the transit. In other words, from Djibouti forward, and it was perfectly good. However, they used that as an excuse to confiscate all the medical supplies. So therefore, we couldn't be operating because we didn't have any medicines, and they held on to them. He said, you have to clear this to the Ministry of Health. So we went to that area up at the Lake Tana. They went into a bit of a confab because there were a lot of big things happening at the time, and those didn't really involve us. But the Minister of Health that had invited us and the Minister of the province, the head of the province, were in conference that weekend. We met with them early. They said, yes, they'd get to it, and they'd talk about it. We could purchase all of the needed supplies from them in excess, and we would leave all of that. And could you leave the units here, too? That wasn't our idea in making a transect of Africa. And on Monday, that Minister of Health resigned for reasons that had nothing to do with us. So as a consequence, we were without our ability to proceed to Tigrini area because that invitation was receded on the basis of some hostility with the Amharic people, not with us. And what we did is we turned around, came on back through Addis, and then went directly to the border in Kenya. That will start transect number 2 because we went home, leaving our units in the wind farm of Lake Turkana Wind Power. And we will tell you all about that with transect number 2 in the Great Rift Valley. For now, however, I would say transect 1, which was January through all of February and March, was a bit of the political, commercial kind of kerfuffle you see when you're transferring valuable units from one developed world into another with multiple transit points in between. Those transit points being the shipping, the Djibouti port with its very, very distinct interests. There are independent Djiboutis. There's an American port with a military base. There's a Chinese port with a Chinese military base. There is a European port. Then there's a French base because it was a former French colony. All of which are kind of a stir, and you have to go from one to the other. And my GPS marker map shows a spider web of my going in and around Djibouti, trying clearing all of those, with the help of Edna Adan, who accompanied us, and her Somaliland drivers from the embassy that they maintained there. So then, coming to Hargeisa for its inauguration, and the mobile surgical units proved their worth. We had 2 cooperating medical schools, Edna Adan's medical school and the Hargeisa Medical School, and a very well-motivated group of people, largely displaced peoples themselves, who were responsive to, number 1, the people that they serve, and number 2, very eager to learn from us in whatever we could. We are in continuing correspondence with them. We will return. And this time we will take those that have been most helpful to us and carry them with us to other sites in Somaliland, Berbera, the port on the Red Sea, and to the new medical school that's on the border with Ethiopia. We will not be re-entering Ethiopia. And the reason for that is that we had a relatively good experience there, at least with respect to the delivery of care. But it looked to me like we were being exploited for service and not for education there. Even though, as you point out, there are 2 different tiers in Ethiopia. One is remote, it is poor, and one is highly advanced and really relates not to those poor people at all, but to European and to American. The largest group of physicians, this is one of those stunning facts. that I point out because I live in Maryland, not the biggest of the United States. And there are more Ethiopian physicians in Maryland than there are in Ethiopia. So that of those developed peoples, the majority had gone abroad. And now a few of them are coming back as the economics in Addis have changed. But they don't want to go into that public health system of the Ministry of Health and go out into the remote areas, which is why each of my trainees who were there as indentured servants for the couple of years that they had to pay back their school, one of them had a book, and the book title was Idiomatic American English. One of the others was saying, I'm studying very hard now, what do I do to get a visa? Because there's no future for me here in Ethiopia. What I'd like to do is come to America, get to be very, very skilled and experienced, and then come back to that first world Ethiopia in Amharic region. And a number of these people actually tried to get with us as we moved back in our mobile surgical units out of the highlands, in our mobile surgical units across this dusty, unpaved highland switchbacks to get back to the diesel fumes of Addis Ababa because they were uncomfortable. They said it made them ill to be in remote highland country. All of that shows you something that's not unique to Ethiopia. It's rather universal. Once you have an exposure to a developed environment where working is at least facilitated, if not easy, it's hard to go back. And if the primary motivation is not the service of one's own people, it is how can I get to those people I want to serve and have the lifestyle that I would like to do in servicing them. So that's a phenomenon we have to face continuously with our Mission to Heal project. Now we're going to go on from this to Transect number 2, which had much of the same problems, but in a totally different environment, and that was the Great Rift. But we were in the Somali Desert, in the capital of Somaliland, where we had a highly successful and well-motivated group. We went on to Ethiopian highlands and had there a group of people who were mostly eager to identify with us so as to go abroad. We were able to take care of people, but necessarily a number of those steps that we would like to have had in indigenizing care did not take place because they were saying to me something quite simple, really, and understandable. Why are you here when everyone here wants to be there? Maybe I can come and replace you. And so one of the things we don't do is export skill. We aren't saying we are here to teach you how to do something that doesn't service your people who are in great need and have you come to a redundantly supplied, developed world. And that is a very hard thing for them not to dream of, even if they may give lip service to the contrary, that many of them view this as an export agency. So that is a balancing act that must continuously occur. And the well-motivated and those who are interested in servicing their populations have to take on a very large burden with very limited reward. If that reward isn't intrinsic, it's very difficult to give them something beyond what it is that they would get from shirking that service. And I find that is the critical piece of Mission to Heal, to identify those who need to learn the skills and are motivated to employ them in the service of humanity. There are any number who want the skills as a method, a ladder to get them out of this environment into some place they'd rather be for their own lifestyle and their own benefit. Difficult, not impossible, and it has worked variably. And I give you 2 examples, Somaliland, which I'd say is better, and Ethiopia, which was not as good, and then we'll have mixtures in Kenya and Uganda, which are part of the same warp and woof, and how to balance them is one of the efforts that we have to continuously work on.
Wow. That's a good story. That really is.
The Horn of Africa, one of the lesser known parts of it, and one of those that is sort of a meeting ground of the Asian and the African, and it is a bit of Middle Eastern as well, because of the religious, almost everyone there has made the Hajj or has been accommodating that traffic for millennia, because the tilting of the earth that we mentioned in a prior podcast allows the trade winds twice a year to get a dhow right off to Yemen and right off to Oman and Muscat and places of the kind that are regularly on the other end of that trade route, so that there are people on each side that understand each other well. They have the same language, the same religion, and much of the same cultural habits. So that the Horn of Africa may look a bit like the Gulf states, with the exception of the fact that there's no oil underfoot, and as a consequence, they've had to scramble in other means, much of it commercial as opposed to extractive. So there isn't much to extract from that economy, except for the most primitive, which no one thinks of as a valued commodity because you can't sell it: the origins of the Nile.
Well, yeah, I'm right up to my ears in that already because I'm not sure how familiar you are with the area of Egypt called the Fayoum.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it is really in bad sorts right now on trying to make it regain its productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And it is failing miserably because of the salinization of the land. And it's total incapacity in terms of trying to treat the land properly and of a scale sufficient to cure that problem. And they aren't even coming close.
Salting the earth, and that's what's happening, of course, with the control of the Nile, is that you no longer get the freshwater effluvium with its nutrients as well.
Right.
And there's another area in the Horn called Puntland, which is essentially like the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia, which not much can happen. And people transit through it, but don't live there because the resources are not there for them to live.
That was what was absolutely amazing me about what they were doing in Ethiopia, is actually getting the right amount of water to the land, not too much, not too little, because both cause problems.
Yes.
And yet in Egypt, they aren't even coming close. It's a damn shame because it's a good productive area.
Mm-hmm. And the highlands are the tall mountains of the Ethiopian spine there on the border of the rift. Remember, Ethiopia has both the Blue and the White Niles. Mm-hmm. It has altitude sufficient to capture those rain clouds. Yeah. It has the origins of the earliest Judaism, Abrahamic faiths, Islam, and Christianity all together in one place, thereby antedating all the conflicts of the later times that we know. And so they should be a nation state that would be a good model of what could be happening in Africa. And in many areas, they are. In fact, they are quite advanced. But they are quite advanced at the expense of a number of people, one or two of whom live in what is essentially Death Valley. The Afar people is the hottest spot on the planet. It is also the most waterless spot on the planet. And the Afar people have been shunned by the nation states around them. I mean, the Afar are sort of neglected by the Ethiopians. Oh, but they're not Somali. Oh, and they're not Somali. Oh, and we don't own them in Djibouti. And so as a consequence, they are sort of the migrant nomads that have to identify themselves by some other skill than just the property in which they sit.
Well, the other one, that came as a bit of a surprise to me, because I've done a lot of irrigation work over the years, but the one that really surprised me a little was the degree to which salinization was taking along the seashores of Egypt, where they're actually getting salinization from the seawater coming in under the ground,
right?
Just like in the Netherlands,
like the Rio Grande,
right?
Exactly.
Right.
And what happens there is that was the origin of many of the economic mainstays of Egypt. Long fiber cotton came from that spot exactly at the end of the tail end of the delta. Now that is no longer able to grow cotton; is no longer able to grow even grazing land. I mean, so that is a consequence of overuse of the fresh water. And therefore, what you're doing is losing.
I'm trying to show you something here. Where is it? Oh, I don't know where it is.
see it.
Well, describe it to me.
It's a series of daguerreotype photographs. And one of them is of that exact happening in the Egypt of 1880. But
Daguerreotypes were the earliest of our fixed black and white
Right.
silver photos, and they would be a great resource because now and then, I mean, we're talking about getting serial pictures every other year from glaciers.
yeah,
That's even better because you have century apart.
I'm just going to sneak around here and see if I can find it. Herodotus?
We've heard his name earlier.
Yeah. Lake Moeris. I'm not sure that's the way they pronounce it. Nope. I can't find it.
Okay. We will think about it on the next transect, and you'll say, aha, now we can go back to transect 1 in the Horn of Africa. One of the places that most
Here
of
we
the
are.
folks that are eager to go to Africa, not too many of them have said, I'm eager to get to the Horn of Africa and look into the Afar Desert. Collodion silver prints.
Oh, I know where they are. They're not there at all. Ah, dear. Yeah, it's really sad because, you know, you suddenly see what they were doing in Egypt in the old days and how they were doing very nicely, thank you. Way better than what they're doing today, which isn't a very, very good compliment to pay anyone.
The good old days have to always be measured on balance because there were some things about the era that was good.
Right.
And then there probably reflected our powerlessness, our powerlessness to overwhelm natural forces and substitute our own interests. Then you have to say, yeah, there are some other natural things there that weren't so wholesome. They were called tetanus and polio and malaria and 4 or 5 other things that are not
my
goods.
father-in-law's family being cotton millers.
Oh, yes.
There was their cotton land and how they watered it in the old days in 1880.
Either donkey power or human power, right?
Oh, yes.
To date, they have water wheels there that are both human and donkey powered with skins that elevate the water from very, very deep shafts.
Wow.
Deeper now than then.
Anyway, we should show this. You should hold it up. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, what is that that lady is wearing?
Well, in fact, she has, this is the veil, not a full veil. It is a veil of all but the eyes. And there are different cultural pieces, especially of the Shia. You can expose the eyes, for example, in some parts of the world. That's legitimate. In others, with the complete chador and triple veils are required. So this is the hijab, which is the hair covering. And the women who wear it, especially in the Western world, such as in Europe or in America, would be called hijabis. That is, they elect to wear the head covering. It's their option so to do, I suspect, in such places as America or Europe. In these areas, not. Even Western women must wear the hijab. The area of the masking, especially with respect to just the eyes being visible, is more Shia than Sunni. And those who are really strict Sunni, like the Wahhabi sect, must have a chador that covers the eyes as well. About the only reason that you can tell which way a woman is headed is whether she wears eyeglasses or not, because you see the disturbance of the veil by the glasses themselves. So that this is something that is supposed to be worn when in public. The only person who can lift that veil is the husband. And a woman must travel in the company of a first-order male, her father, her husband, or her son. And if she does have a husband, she must come with a letter from that husband if she's traveling with either father or son. So that neither one of these trumps the primary one, which is husbandry, which is essentially ownership. And remember, she has no name. The name on her passport. Remember, you got to have a passport photo? I mean, what does one passport photo look any different than another if they're all of a chador? And the reason there is that only one person can lift that veil, and that is your husband. So you're dealing with a little disturbance, not necessarily between the era of the daguerreotype and Eastman Kodak up to digital era. You're looking at 1,600 years of back history here. The genes outlast our culture. So that right here is a cultural residual. This is a relic. And at present, that would be very offensive if I said that in some other area of the world. However, it does seem odd that you can't identify one female from another as a third party unless the husband wishes so to authorize with a name. So it's one part of the cultural differences that we see while dealing in a hybrid zone, such as the Horn of Africa, which is mixed Middle East Africa, in the same way that we have some of them on the northern coast of Africa, which are mixed European Africa, like Morocco or areas of Algiers and the like.
Interesting. Well, learn something every day.
I hope.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was wonderful. And we'll have to come back with transect number 3.
We've got 2 and 3 to go because we haven't hit the Rift Valley, and then we got to hit the origins.
Oh,
of
okay,
Nile.
right, okay.
Very good. Do you want to go right to it?
I think I need a rest.
Okay. Can we click that one then? You have to expand it. Up there on top on the right. Nope. Nope.
What?
Right there.
Here?
Yeah. In the middle. Yep. Click. Or just hit it. Yep. Okay, now you have to hit that button.